The Birmingham bus, a lumbering green beast, reeked of a potent cocktail, stale diesel, the faint sweetness of old chewing gum clinging to the plastic seats, and the metallic tang of rain clinging to damp denim jackets. It was a Thursday evening, and the city was exhaling after a long day. The sky, a bruised purple bleeding into a hazy orange, cast long shadows that stretched and distorted familiar buildings into eerie silhouettes. Ethan, all of 14 years old, slumped in a middle-row seat, his earbuds pumping out a generic blend of synth-pop. He wasn't really listening. The music was just a shield, a way to disappear into the anonymity of the commute. School had been a blur of geometry quizzes and whispered gossip, and all he wanted was to get home, crash on his worn couch, and lose himself in the pixelated worlds of his video games. He stared out the window, the familiar route a monotonous slideshow, the faded brick of the old warehouse district, the flickering neon signs of pawn shops and payday lenders. The endless stream of cars snaking through the thickening traffic. He knew every pothole, every broken streetlight, every boarded-up storefront. It was a comfortable kind of boredom, a predictable rhythm to the end of his day. But tonight, the rhythm faltered. It started subtly, a prickle of unease that crawled up his spine. He wasn't sure what drew his attention, but his gaze drifted forward towards the front of the bus. And that's when he saw her. She was sitting a few rows ahead, near the emergency exit, her posture unnaturally rigid. She couldn't have been much older than him, maybe 15 or 16. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, accentuating the sharp angles of her face. She wore a faded denim jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, and her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Ethan initially dismissed it. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she'd had a fight with her parents. Maybe she was just having a bad day. Adolescence was a minefield of anxieties and insecurities, and everyone had their moments. But the longer he watched, the more his unease grew. She wasn't looking at her phone like every other teenager on the bus. She wasn't staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. She was simply frozen. Her shoulders were hunched, her jaw tight, and her eyes darted nervously around the bus, as if searching for something or someone. And then there was him, the man sitting next to her. He was older, late 30s maybe, with a lean, almost predatory build. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his forehead, obscuring most of his face. He wasn't talking to her, but his body language spoke volumes. He was leaning in too close, his arm resting on the seat back in a way that seemed calculated, almost possessive. Ethan's stomach clenched. There was something off, something that didn't quite fit. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were together. Maybe he was her older brother. Maybe he was just being paranoid, seeing danger where there was none. But the feeling persisted, a nagging voice whispering in the back of his mind. And then he saw her hands again. They were trembling, not violently, but a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor that betrayed her inner turmoil. And that's when she did it. Her right hand, still clenched in her lap, moved slightly. She lifted it near her chest, and then, with a deliberate motion, she folded her fingers down, curling them into her palm, trapping her thumb inside. It was a quick, almost furtive movement, but Ethan saw it. He recognized it. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that signal. A few months ago, bored on a rainy Saturday afternoon, Ethan had stumbled upon a TikTok video. It was a public service announcement, a short, looping clip explaining a simple hand gesture. Fingers up, thumb tucked in, fingers closing over the thumb. The distress signal. A silent cry for help. The video had explained that it was a discreet way for someone in danger to signal that they needed assistance, without alerting their abuser or captor. It was a symbol of silent desperation, a lifeline thrown into the digital void. At the time, Ethan had dismissed it as just another piece of internet ephemera, a fleeting trend destined to be forgotten in a week. He'd scrolled past it, barely registering its significance. But now, seeing that same gesture performed on a crowded Birmingham bus, the TikTok video flashed through his mind with startling clarity. His heart pounded in his chest. Was he really seeing what he thought he was seeing? Was this girl actually in danger? He looked around the bus, his eyes darting from face to face. No one else seemed to notice. The woman across the aisle was engrossed in her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. The businessman in the back was snoring softly, his head lolling against the window. The bus driver, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, was oblivious to the drama unfolding behind him. It was like he was the only one who saw it, the only one who understood. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a jolt of responsibility that he wasn't prepared for. He was just a kid. He was supposed to be worrying about homework and video games, not potential kidnapping victims. He started to second-guess himself. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he was misinterpreting the gesture. Maybe it was just a nervous tic, a random movement with no deeper meaning. He glanced at the girl again. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She wasn't making eye contact with anyone, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the bus windows. And the man beside her. He still hadn't said a word, but his presence was oppressive, a heavy weight in the confined space. His arm was still draped across the seat back, effectively blocking her in. Ethan's mind raced. He had to do something. But what? He could ignore it, pretend he didn't see anything, tell himself it wasn't his problem, let someone else handle it. But the thought made his stomach churn with guilt. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing, not if this girl was truly in danger. He could try to intervene directly, confront the man, ask the girl if she was okay. But that seemed risky, even reckless. What if he was wrong? What if he escalated the situation? Put himself in danger? He could call the police. But what would he say? He had no proof, just a hunch based on a TikTok video and a feeling of unease. Would they even take him seriously? He felt paralyzed by indecision, trapped between his conscience and his fear. And then the girl did it again. Faster this time. More desperate. The gesture was almost frantic. A silent scream for help. And this time, the man noticed. Ethan couldn't be sure what gave him away. Maybe it was the way the girl's fingers curled, the subtle tension in her hand. Maybe it was the slight twitch in her movements, the almost imperceptible flinch. But the man's head snapped up, his eyes darting around the bus. They flicked left, then right, searching, assessing. It was a quick, almost imperceptible scan, but Ethan saw it. He saw the cold, calculating look in the man's eyes. Ethan quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing in his ears. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like he'd been caught staring into the abyss. The bus slowed for a stop, the doors hissing open with a sigh of compressed air. A few passengers shuffled off, disappearing into the gathering darkness. For a split second, Ethan wondered if the man would leave. But he didn't. He remained seated, his posture even more rigid, his grip on the girl's wrist tightening. Ethan saw her wince, a barely perceptible flicker of pain in her eyes. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough. It confirmed his worst fears. He wasn't imagining things. This girl was in trouble. His palms were slick with sweat as he lowered his phone onto his lap, his fingers hovering over the screen. He had a choice to make, a real, life-altering choice. He could ignore it, pretend he didn't see anything, let someone else handle it, or he could do something. But what if he was wrong? What if he called the cops and it turned out to be nothing? What if he embarrassed himself? What if he made things worse? He was just a kid. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't trained for this. But then, the girl lifted her eyes, and for the briefest of moments, she looked straight at him. Their eyes met, just for a fleeting second, a connection forged in the crucible of fear and desperation. But it was enough. Ethan saw it, the raw, unfiltered terror in her eyes, the silent plea for help, the unspoken message, please, don't let him take me. It was a look that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His pulse pounded in his ears, a deafening roar that drowned out the sounds of the bus. This was real. This was happening. The girl's eyes locked onto his for just a moment longer, long enough for him to see the desperation, the silent begging, the absolute terror. And then, the man pulled her closer. It was subtle, just a small shift in his posture like he was trying to make it seem natural. But Ethan saw the way the girl tensed up the way her body stiffened, the way her free hand gripped the edge of her seat, knuckles white. His stomach churned. She wasn't just uncomfortable. She wasn't just nervous. She was trapped. And no one else on this bus was doing anything. Ethan's fingers hovered over his phone screen. He opened the messaging app, his thumb shaking as he started typing. 911. His breath felt shallow, his chest tight. He forced himself to think, to focus. What do I even say? His brain scrambled for the right words. If he made it sound like a joke, they might ignore it. If he was too vague, they might not take it seriously. He had to get this right. His thumbs moved fast, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I'm on bus 23. There's a girl up front making the distress hand signal. She's with a man in a hoodie and she looks scared. He just grabbed her wrist. I think something's wrong. He hit send before he could talk himself out of it. The message went through. Now all he could do was wait. But waiting was torture. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. He kept glancing at the girl, his heart aching with a mixture of fear and helplessness. She wasn't moving anymore, her body rigid, her breathing shallow. Her eyes remained fixed on her lap, as if she was trying to disappear. And the man, his knee bounced nervously, a telltale sign of anxiety. He knew something was up. He could feel it. Ethan risked another glance at him. The man wasn't looking at the girl anymore. He was scanning the bus again, his head turning slightly, his eyes sweeping the seats. He was looking for someone who had noticed. Ethan's stomach twisted. Did he look suspicious? Was he staring too much? Had he given himself away? He forced himself to shift in his seat, unlocking his phone, pretending to scroll through social media. He swiped at the screen mindlessly, pretending to text a friend. But his mind was screaming. Where are the cops? His fingers hovered over the screen again. Maybe he should text back, ask for an ETA. But would that make him seem impatient? Would they think he was making it up? Then, the man moved. Not a big movement, just a small lean forward, like he was whispering something to the girl. She flinched. Ethan's stomach flipped. He didn't hear what the man said, but the girl barely nodded in response. It was like she didn't want to, but she was too scared not to. And then, she stood up. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The bus was approaching another stop. The girl was getting off. No, no, no. The man stood up too, his hand still wrapped around her wrist as he nudged her toward the exit. He was trying to make it look casual, like a normal interaction. But Ethan saw the way the girl's shoulders tightened, the way her face was drained of all color. If she left this bus, she was gone. Panic rose in Ethan's throat, choking him. This wasn't supposed to happen. The police weren't here yet. He couldn't just sit here. Do not intervene. The dispatcher's words echoed in his head, a cold, authoritative voice that seemed to weigh him down. But if he didn't do something now, what if there was no later? The doors hissed open, revealing the dimly lit street outside. The girl hesitated, just for a second, her eyes darting nervously around the bus. And Ethan made his choice. He shot up from his seat, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Hey! His voice cracked, a shaky shout that barely pierced the din of the bus. But it was loud enough. A few heads turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. The girl froze, her body stiffening. The man whipped his head around, his eyes narrowed, his face a mask of barely suppressed rage. Ethan's legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath him. But he forced himself to hold his ground, to meet the man's gaze. Hey, his mind raced, searching for an excuse, a reason to intervene that wouldn't immediately raise suspicion. He couldn't just blurt out, I know you're in danger. That would make things worse. His eyes darted around, desperate for inspiration. They landed on the girl, her face etched with fear. He blurted out the first thing that came to his head. Hey, aren't you in my history class? The girl's eyes widened, her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion, just for a split second. And then, she played along. Oh, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah. The man's grip on her wrist tightened, a barely perceptible squeeze that sent a fresh wave of fear through Ethan. He saw the muscles in the man's arm flex, a silent warning. Really? The man's voice was low, almost a growl. Too low, too controlled. What school do you go to? Ethan's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break his ribs. He had to think fast. He had to keep the man talking, buy time until the police arrived. He swallowed hard, trying to project an air of casual confidence that he didn't feel. Northwood High, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Mr. Henderson's class, right? He glanced at the girl, hoping she would pick up on the cue. She nodded quickly, her eyes pleading with him. Yeah, that's right. The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting between Ethan and the girl. He didn't seem convinced. I didn't know you two knew each other, he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. Yeah, well, we don't really know each other, Ethan stammered. We just, see each other in class. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back. He was improvising, making it up as he went along, and he had no idea if it was working. The man's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then shifted back to the girl. We should get going, he said, his voice curt. He tugged on her wrist, urging her toward the open doors. Ethan's stomach dropped. He was losing her. He had to do something, anything, to stop them. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a piercing wail shattered the tense silence. A siren. The sound grew louder, closer, a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the streets. Flashing red and blue lights danced across the bus windows, painting the interior in a chaotic strobe. The bus driver's radio crackled to life. Dispatch says hold at this stop, the driver called out, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. Police incoming. The man's entire body went rigid, his muscles coiling like a spring. Ethan didn't breathe. The bus doors were still open, the dimly lit street beckoning. The girl was one step away from being pulled outside, swallowed by the darkness. Would he run? Would he drag her with him? Would he resort to violence? Ethan prayed he wouldn't have to find out. Then, the officers stormed in. Two of them, a man and a woman, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the bus with practiced efficiency. The moment they stepped onto the bus, the atmosphere changed. The air crackled with tension, the unspoken threat of force. The man in the hoodie tensed even more. His grip on the girl's wrist didn't loosen, but Ethan could see the calculation in his eyes. Run or stay, fight or act normal. The bus driver had already stepped aside, giving the cops a clear view of the situation. The first officer, a stocky man in his 40s with a weathered face and a steely gaze, moved down the aisle with sharp, deliberate steps. His partner, a tall woman with a sharp, almost hawk-like profile, scanned the rows of passengers, her eyes missing nothing. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm, to project an air of innocence. He was just a kid. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he knew that the next few seconds could determine everything. Then the girl made a sound. It was tiny, barely audible, but it was enough. A shakingali, a suppressed sobi. Like someone trying to hold back tears after a lifetime of pain. The male officer's eyes snapped to her, then to the man still gripping her wrist. Sir, the officer said, his voice steady but firm. Let her go. Silence. A long, painful silence that stretched out like an eternity. Ethan swore he could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to drown out everything else. The man didn't move, didn't blink. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked on the officer's face. His grip on the girl's wrist remained locked. Let her go, the officer repeated, his hand hovering near his holster now, a subtle but unmistakable warning. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man released her. The girl yanked her arm back, clutching it to her chest like she'd been burned. The moment she was free, her entire body seemed to collapse inward. She took one stumbling step toward the officer, then another. Her legs wobbled, threatening to give out beneath her. And then, she broke. Tears spilled down her face, hot and uncontrolled, as she gasped out, I didn't know what to do. Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That was all the confirmation the cops needed. The woman officer moved fast. In a single, fluid motion, she pulled the girl aside, putting herself between her and the man. Her arm went around the girl's shoulders, a gesture of comfort and protection. Then everything happened at once. The male officer reached for the man's arm. "Sir, stand up." The man bolted. He lunged toward the bus doors. Desperation etched on his face. But he was too slow. The officer grabbed him, yanking him backward with surprising force. The man fought back, thrashing like a wild animal caught in a trap. Passengers gasped, some screamed. The bus driver backed away quickly, his face pale with shock. The struggle lasted 5 messy, chaotic seconds. Then, the man was slammed face down onto the floor, the officer's knee pressed firmly into his back. Cuffs clicked. "It's over," the officer grunted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're done." But Ethan's head was spinning. Who was he? What was he planning to do? Why had he targeted this girl? As if on cue, another officer entered the bus. Radio in hand. "We got him," he said into the receiver, his voice tight with satisfaction. Then, after a pause, he added, "Yeah, it's him." Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. Him. Like they knew who he was. Like he was a known quantity, a wanted man. The girl was still crying, her sobs shaking her entire body. The woman officer was speaking to her softly, trying to calm her down, reassuring her that she was safe. And then Ethan heard something he would never forget. A second officer, still outside the bus, called back toward the entrance. "We've been looking for this guy. He's wanted in 2 other states for kidnapping." Kidnapping. The word hit Ethan like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of him. He had been right. Dead right. This man wasn't some overprotective relative, some misunderstood boyfriend. He was a predator. A monster. And if Ethan hadn't seen the signal, if he hadn't said something, if he hadn't acted, the girl would have been gone. The bus felt different now. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface had finally cracked open, leaving only stunned silence in its wake. The air was thick with unspoken fear, with a lingering scent of adrenaline and the faint metallic tang of blood. The girl. She still hadn't stopped crying. Not loud, not wailing, just those quiet, exhausted sobs that sounded like she had been holding them in for way too long. Her shoulders shook with each sob, her body a fragile, trembling thing. The female officer had a gentle hand on her shoulder, speaking to her in a calm, steady voice. "You're safe now, okay? No one's going to hurt you." But the girl barely reacted. She was still shaking, her eyes glazed with shock. The trauma was etched on her face, a visible scar that would take a long time to heal. Ethan wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her it was over, that the man was never going to hurt her again. He wanted to offer her some kind of comfort, some kind of reassurance. But what do you even say to someone who just went through that? How do you find the words to express the enormity of the situation, the depth of her fear? He didn't know. So he just sat there, phone still clutched in his hands, watching as the officers guided the man, the kidnapper, off the bus in handcuffs. The man's head was bowed, his face hidden by the hoodie, but Ethan could feel his anger, his resentment, his defeated rage. Outside, more police cars had pulled up, their lights bouncing off the windows in flashes of red and blue. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering, pointing, their faces a mixture of curiosity and morbid fascination. Ethan barely heard them. His mind was still spinning, replaying the events of the past few minutes, agonizing over the choices he had made, the risks he had taken. He had been this close to ignoring it, to assuming it wasn't his problem, to looking away and going home like nothing happened. And if he had, his stomach churned. He didn't even want to think about it. The male officer stepped back onto the bus. His face wasn't as stern now. There was something softer in his eyes, a hint of compassion, a glimmer of respect. "Hey, kid," he said, crouching down slightly so they were eye level. "You the one who called this in?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The officer let out a slow breath, a sigh of relief. "You just saved her life." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He swallowed hard, looking down at his hands, his fingers still trembling. "I almost didn't," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. "But you did," the officer said, his voice firm. "That's what matters." Ethan let those words sink in, letting their weight settle in his heart. He had done something good. He had made a difference. The officer patted his shoulder before standing back up. We'll need a statement from you, but I just want you to know what you did today. That was brave. Ethan didn't feel brave. He felt weird, like the world had just shifted under his feet and nothing would ever be quite the same again. He felt a strange mix of exhilaration and exhaustion, of pride and fear. But when he glanced at the girl, still shaken but safe, still being comforted by the female officer, he knew one thing for sure. He would do it again, in a heartbeat. The bus finally pulled away from the scene, leaving behind a cluster of flashing lights and a crowd of onlookers. The journey continued, but nothing felt normal anymore. The air was still thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional sniffle or nervous cough. Ethan wasn't sure if it ever would feel normal again. The girl was safe now. The man, the predator, was in custody, facing charges that would likely keep him behind bars for a long time. The police had taken Ethan's statement, thanked him profusely, and told him that if he ever needed to talk, there were people who could help him process everything he had witnessed. But all he could think about was how close she had come to disappearing. How many times had people ignored things like this? How many times had someone seen something strange, but brushed it off because they didn't want to get involved? And how many times had it ended with someone never coming home? He looked down at his phone. The text to 911 was still there, a record of the moment he had made his choice, the moment he had decided to act. It was a simple message, less than 30 words, typed out in a moment of panic and fear. And yet, it had made all the difference. As the bus rolled toward his stop, he made a quiet promise to himself. If he ever saw something like this again, he wouldn't hesitate. He wouldn't second-guess himself. He wouldn't let fear paralyze him. Because today, he learned something important. Sometimes, speaking up can save a life. Years later, Ethan would still remember that bus ride. He would remember the smell, the faces, the fear. He would remember the girl's eyes, the desperation in her plea. And he would remember the weight of that thumb, tucked into her palm, a silent symbol of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. He became an advocate for awareness, sharing his story, encouraging others to learn the distress signal, to be vigilant, to speak up. He knew that human trafficking and kidnapping happened more often than people realized, that it thrived in the shadows, hidden in plain sight. And he knew that sometimes the smallest action, noticing a hand signal, making a call, sending a text, could change everything. If you ever see someone making the distress signal, fingers up, thumb tucked in, fingers closing over the thumb, don't ignore it. Act. Call the authorities. Alert someone nearby. Do something. You might just save a life.